I want to welcome everybody. Many people here I know, so that's so nice for me to have people from my Harvard Freshman Seminar course and colleagues from Cambridge Health Alliance and neighbors and friends. And this is really, for me, a culmination of a long journey, and my daughter, too. What I'm going to do is I took excerpts from my memoir and sort of tried to read them together. So I still want you to get the book, but it's meant to really give a flow of what my journey's been. And for those of you who just need a little bullet to know what the background of what I'm going to start to be reading about, my mother committed suicide when I was 4 years old, and I was the youngest of 6 children. And there had been a fierce custody battle with my father, and she died on the day that it was stayed for her to get the kids back. So it was a fairly kind of dramatic suicide. It happened in 1963. I just turned 50 yesterday, so this is my birthday present. I can't think of a better place to read because I'm been such a long-term fan of Harvard Bookstore, and I always am sneaking in here to buy books, and so it's such an honor to be in this room sharing this with you. And thank you, Jeff and Christina and Mike. So I'm just going to start. The day my mother killed herself, she had just finished preparing her house on Marlborough Street for the anticipated return of her children after a fierce custody battle with my father. It was a house expecting people, 14 rooms and 5.5 baths in a turn-of-the-century townhouse on a tree-lined street near the Boston Public Garden where my mother lived with her new husband, Alex. I imagine that when my mother heard Judge Whittemore's decision, cold dread must have overcome her. In my mind, she was white as powder, her body slack and weighted down, stumbling from one room to the next, overwhelmed by the vacancy. It is family lore that I am the last person my mother saw before she killed herself. She drove to my father's house, pleading to see the children, but I was the only child at home. My father demanded that she leave. B, our housekeeper, hustled me out the door and down the driveway toward my mother, who waited, desolate, on the street. She bent down and caressed my hair. I remember as she whispered instructions to B to watch over us, especially me. And then she left. She left a suicide note as well as a grocery list, a list in preparation for our arrival that would never happen. 6 tangerines, 2 boxes of Kleenex, pink is crossed out and replaced by blue, sugar-free root beer, blue toilet paper, 4 pounds of rump roast, lettuce, tomatoes, food for a family. I am often asked if I remember my mother. I appreciate that the question is a way to express the hope that my loss has been tempered, at least by a photograph, a necklace, or her words, anything I might call on to evoke her presence. But I have a few mementos and even fewer memories. My mother is defined by her absence. Yes, some treasures can kindle her presence, a dainty birth announcement on elegant paper, stamped with the date of my birth, a tarnished silver baby cup, dented at the rim and inscribed with my name, my worn woolen baby blanket, a pamphlet from my mother's campaign for the Boston School Committee. I have a few photographs, the pictures, a tatty blanket, a baby's cup. These objects are all that I have after my mother's death. When I was young, I thought a fire had destroyed all her belongings. My father eventually told me when I was about 14 that my mother had attempted suicide 2 years before her death. My sister and I discovered the facts ourselves in our trusted library's microfilm collection. We found a picture of my mother in the Record American, looking much younger than she does in her formal portrait. She wears a sporty silk scarf tied casually around her neck. She's spunky with her upturned nose. Takes 3 handfuls of sleeping tablets, the caption reads. Why did my mother kill herself? My memories don't provide an answer, and I'm wary of my father's account because it's not my own. And my mother's affair that led her away from the marriage must have jolted him. But as a psychiatrist, I'm prepared, I hope, to understand. In The Anatomy of a Suicide, the clinical researcher Leston Haven writes that suicide is the final common pathway of diverse circumstances of an interdependent network rather than an isolated cause, a knot of circumstances tightening around a single time and place. Suicide demands to be explained by the living as a way to absolve or condemn the survivors. I have tried to create a meaningful narrative to understand what happened, recognizing that the truth is buried with the victim and that questions will always linger. When I met people as I was growing up, all the way to medical school interviews, if I told them that my mother died when I was 4, they were curious about how she died. The question was irresistible. Most people seemed relieved when I said barbiturates, as if death and sleep are siblings. People wanted to know why and what was the cause. Such questions are usually edged with fear that premature death, especially a self-inflicted death, might somehow be contagious. Why would she kill herself becomes, what does this mean about you? Somehow, confessing that my mother committed suicide felt incriminating, proof that my mother's life was out of control. I worried that they would mistakenly assume I somehow played a part in that. A secure mother-child bond is created when a mother provides her baby with the comforting rhythms of feeding, sleep, and an organized home. Without that gentle sense of order, children may have difficulty managing their emotions, lack self-control, and lose confidence in their likability. Either I have a very active imagination, or my mother must have been able to keep her sadness at bay long enough to nurture me as a baby. During the 1950s, my mother was unusual, an upper-class woman who had 6 children and worked outside of the home. The prevailing cultural expectation was for women to tend to the home, not orchestrate campaigns. My mother had enough resources to hire support to care for her brood so that she could conduct a career also. Because she had grown up as the daughter and granddaughter of Massachusetts politicians, she was enamored with politics. Many pundits of that time, however, were disparaging about women in public life. In 1956, Life magazine published interviews with 5 prominent male psychiatrists who blamed the rising divorce rate on the quote-unquote fatal error that feminism propagated. They warned that women were neglecting their maternal instincts, competing with their husbands, and causing psychological damage to their children. Those were the times my mother lived in and forged a career as she raised a family. And here I am, a wife and mother with a very full career. I'm aware of the impact of my past, And I do not want to distance with my children the shadow of unexplored grief. Rather than burdening my children with my bereavement, I want to let them see how I deal with the painful longing for lost family without depriving them of my presence. I don't want to be overly nostalgic about my mother. I don't want the upheaval from my loss to undermine how I connect with my children. Rather, I want to find strength in understanding. My children have watched me as I have tried to understand who my mother was, knowing that I write what I used to call letters to Mama, that are my way of telling my mother who I am and who my children are becoming. I try to penetrate the incomprehensible mystery of her death and to somehow show them our enduring connection to those we love. Corey, ever the concrete thinker, once asked me, where was I sending the letters? He was younger then, he's 17 now. Lila said that maybe in my dreams my mother would write back. Sometimes I peer into an apparent void, a one-way dialogue with too much room for projection. My family history gives me a fragmented and sanitized view of my mother. I often feel as I am figuratively tugging on her apron strings, pleading for something more, starved for a tasty morsel that will satiate my desire to know her in a way that is intimate and familiar. For years, I had nothing of my mother's, nothing concrete. Suddenly, a trunk of her belongings came to light. A blue trunk with brass hinges, with drawings, letters of all kinds of material that my mother had saved. Seeing these objects stunned me. I stood there staring. I was nervous and intrigued about what I would discover. Here was evidence of a life I did not know. Small calendars with hand-scrawled appointments, a high school yearbook, report cards, school awards, newspaper clippings, and chatty letters from friends. A photo of my mother cradling me as a baby in her arms. A photo of my mother and father, their eyes filled with laughter. Her handwriting big and full. And the novel she was in the process of writing at the time of her death. I was disturbed that it had taken so long for Dad to give his children the contents of the trunk. Dad later told me, understandably, he said he had enough integrity not to destroy it. He said, I kept it for a couple of years and didn't know what the hell to do with it. I didn't want to be involved dividing things. God forbid something was missing. I never opened the trunk, and I didn't know what was in it. Her novel was an amazing discovery. This was an irresistible chance to know my mother's mind. Writers cannot escape that the person in charge of organizing a story reveals who she is just by the nature of how she fabricates the narrator's voice. My mother wrote in her notes about her novel, is this sheer, purgative autobiography, or do I want others to see it? I can understand her trepidation. It's hard to be exposed and feel judged. As a psychiatrist, I live in the land of thoughts, and at the risk of overinterpreting, I hoped that this unexpected access to my mother's mind would reveal how she constructed a narrative of meaning, her personal truth. Perhaps it would illuminate how my mother came to see suicide as an option, or how she came to accept the apparent futility of life. As a daughter who has longed for a connection to my mother, I want to know her inner thoughts, to discover her secret messages to me. I want a good story so I can be proud of her. I want to read as a detective and discern what is autobiographical and what is fiction. I know I must have known her long enough to love her, or I wouldn't be working so hard to try to understand who she is. My mother's journals were another rich source of insight into her joys and her anguish. It is clear that she was given to bouts of depression. She wrote vividly about the depth of it and the hopelessness that her affair plunged her into. She said, "Long and uncertain stretched the smooth black road, urging one into forgetfulness, deceiving one into daydreams, long, 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 black insomniac nights." This is her voice. "Broken only by the white line of consciousness and hateful solitudes, as indistinguishable from one another as curves and crossroads before the headlights. Consciousness, uniqueness slowly drains away from the asphalt and from the cottony, lonely wakefulness, until finally there is nothing but the black road ahead and death." She says, "Death is a change in degree rather than in kind, and for many of us is a blessing in neon rather than in disguise." She goes on to say, "My Holy Ghost or my babies, this is my last testament. Perhaps they'll never be strong enough to read my naked soul. Most children prefer a mother to a human being. So do most mothers. My great cross is the inability to lose me in my mother, whether the mother is me or the woman who carried me. Those of us who fight must die. We are all consumed one way or another." This is hers talking, I just want to make sure you know. "I just choose to die from life rather than the slow creeping death of boredom and rote and repetition and habit and conformity and vile hatred passed off as love. The flame of desire for truth, for reality, can burn up all the peace we're rationed. Oh God, where are you? I can tell you what I wanted before, but what do I want now? I guess I'd settle for peace, but that's second best." These are hard words to read as a daughter. Her pain is palpable. She seems to be making a choice. For this passionate and beautiful woman, there clearly was no answer, and she could find no viable choice for herself. Orwell, in his essay, Why I Write, says that authors are driven on by some demon whom one can neither resist nor understand. My journey was one of unrelenting sadness, curiosity, and passion in a quest to understand how, if my mother loved her 6 children, and clearly she did, how she could have abandoned us in this brutal way. As I charted her journey, I revolved around a fixed point, my mother's suicide, and followed any lead that helped me to understand who she was. It was as if the North Star of my existence was framed by trying to resolve this mystery. Sometimes on my odyssey of discovery, I had interviews that made the story more complicated and challenging. Talking to my mother's ex-lover after 40 years revealed both disturbing and insightful information. The doctor who took care of my mother after her final overdose when she was in a coma taught me more. My 5 brothers and sisters offered their poignantly different perspectives. Through the scrutiny of her unpublished novel with the ominous title, End of Freedom, I learned more about the tremendous challenges she faced and to accept her more fully, realizing that what she did had nothing to do with us, her children. Through all this searching and introspection, I've gained new understanding, not just of her life, but of mine, and been able to examine some of my greatest fears. The process has led me to be more open and present for my patients and able to go deeper with them in their own traumas. It's freed me to be a better mother to my own 3 children. I offer my own story as a tribute to the endurance of the human spirit. When loss happens, we can find a way forward. No one is expendable, and we are all loved. By looking at her traumatic childhood, I understand the confusion she must have lived with and her deep dilemma. By sharing her journey, as best as I can reconstruct it, perhaps I can lend a little light to this widespread tragedy. Every 16 minutes, a suicide occurs in the U.S. To help break the terrible silence and dispel the shame that so often surrounds suicide, and to encourage people to get the support they need. If my book touches anyone that way, then my mother's journey was not in vain. I often say it's a gift from the grave that my mother gave me. Suicide is a forbidden topic, and the investigative energy to understand the intensity of it served as a certain reminder of how precious it is for me to be a mother to my children. As Blake said, joy and woe are woven fine, and there is a certain freedom that comes from looking at the dark side and weaving a tapestry of meaning that anchors us in survival and the living soul. Every time I am introduced as an author, or sign a book, or get a wonderful response from a reader who is moved to think deeply and ask large questions that defy easy answers, it is delicious, and I savor the journey. Writing may be about demons and self-doubt, but at this point, I would highlight the rewards. It took me 18 years of painful delving into the past to write. Did I find all the answers? No. As I said, they're buried. Did I reclaim a lost mother? Yes. To a certain degree I did. I feel she is present to me now, not just fleeting impressions and yearning. I have grown to love my mother in a way that's different from when I longed for her as a little girl. There's a joy in that, and to at last to becoming a writer. I am profoundly aware that when I die, a part of me will remain in my children, in the same way that our bones carry the same minerals that compose a star. Thank you. And he has been a true, and I hope when you read it you see, he has been a true hero in this story. One of the things that we know about those kids who are left by a parent is that the surviving father and how, or the surviving mother, whatever, the surviving parent, how well they cope and how stable they are for the child is absolutely critical. So some of the reasons I can stand before you is because I've had an astounding father. So thanks for that question. The question was whether my father had read it, and I said yes. Yeah, sure. So the two questions were, did someone replace or provide support? And the other was, did I have a lot of anger at my mother? So yes to both. In terms of the first question about other mothers, that's the way I think of them. I work in a school-based health center, and the reason I'm there is because I work with a tremendous staff of school nurses and social workers and teachers who are always to children who have had severe losses in their life, acting as other mothers. And it's a critical role that many of us in the healing or teaching professions play with kids, which is to provide an anchor. And I had a wonderful nanny, doesn't quite capture it, but she was very present in my life, and she knew my mother and stayed with us after my mother died, and I was with her when I was small enough to be able to sleep on her pillow. She was B, that I mentioned in there, and I think that made a huge difference for me. In terms of the anger at my mother, I've had like 700 years of therapy, so I think that there are various stages of idealization and anger that you go through when you lose a parent. And when you have a parent that's living, and my dad could testify to this, you can rage at a parent and be upset with them, and they get clay feet. But when you have a dead parent, it's very easy to freeze them in time and to think of them as being all present because they're not there so that was actually, I sort of almost felt like I went through my adolescence when I got the novel, because I was like, there were parts of the novel I didn't really like her, that narrator, that much. I thought she was a little bit high-strung and a little bit self-centered, and I thought, oh boy, maybe if my mom had stuck around, I wouldn't have liked her sometimes, So I don't know if that answers your question. The question was there conflict in my family with me releasing the novel, and did people have different interpretations in it? And what I would say is that with suicide, it is a silent grief often, and people don't talk about it, including in my family. So even though we're a very verbal, opinionated family, we really were raised to not really talk about it with each other and just pretend that somehow she just exited and we didn't really have a conversation about it. So I didn't go back to talk with my brothers and sisters about it until chapter 5, when I spent one summer going back and talking to each brother and sister. And if I were to say one of the biggest gifts of this book is the transformative quality of the relationship of many of my brothers and sisters from that journey. Now, it wasn't a quick journey, and it was 18 years, and it wasn't always smooth, but now there's a level of depth in my relationship with many of my brothers and sisters. My oldest sister, who is 7 years older than me, my mother took an overdose when it was her 11th birthday. It was 2 days before I didn't appreciate that growing up, and I didn't know what that would mean as a mother and how tortured it would be for you to exit on your child's birthday. So I both had a growing closeness to my sister from this. So I would say that if you ever write a memoir, first of all, you probably won't win a popularity contest with your family. You just have to give it up, because you can try to please everybody, but it's not probably going to happen. But you have to own that this is your narrative arc. If one of my siblings or my dad told this story, they would tell a very different story. And I appreciate that, and I really honor that they would allow me to tell my story, in the hopes that, I hope that my book can be life-saving to someone who feels like this is an acceptable solution. I want there to be a sense that when I've worked with depressed patients, they think that it won't matter, that their family really will be okay. And this is a testament to say, you know what, it is 45 years later, and here I am talking about it. So I hope that answers it. What we know is that, first of all, so I want to make sure I got the question. The question is, have my kids approached me about being worried about me being fragile, or them being fragile? Okay, both. I'll take the first one first, me being fragile. I mean, one of the things I feel like I'm very clear about is I'm not going anywhere. I love life and value it, and that's not something I'm planning on at all. And what we do know is the statistics say that if you have a parent who's killed themselves, you are 5 times more likely to kill yourself than the normal population. That said, that's a disturbing statistic, particularly if you're a child who is in that category, but it should be qualified. I'm much more likely to get run over by a car or to have a heart attack than I am to kill myself. And the confounding factors, we're still trying to figure out what makes that vulnerability. Is it a biological propensity to mental illness, because clearly bipolar disorder and depression, if untreated, you can get suicidal. So that's why treatment's so important. So a message to anyone who would have a family member that had killed themselves is keep an eye out for symptoms of depression or bipolar, get treatment, and impulsivity. The toxic combination of suicide is mental illness, impulsivity, and substance abuse. Well, if you are someone who is vulnerable to suicide or has a biological predisposition, there are 2 things that you can really support yourself. Substance abuse, if you treat your substance abuse, you'll be much less likely to kill yourself. So that's a piece that I feel like we're not biologically determined, if we have suicides in our family, to end up going down that road. And I'm really, really lucky. I have 3 incredible kids. And, I don't know, I've often said, I don't think I could do this work if I didn't have the kind of support I have in my home, and that kind of security that my kids are okay. I couldn't take care of other children otherwise. So, there are periods of trepidation for me that I think I am taking a risk. And I have been stunned by how generous people have been with me. That has given me a faith in humanity that's been truly remarkable. And I never was a very orthodox child psychiatrist anyway. I mean, I do home visits in safety assessments for the Cambridge Public School System. Some of the administrators here from the Cambridge Public Schools can testify that I will do what I can to reach kids. And so I wasn't and have never been the kind of psychiatrist that just nods and waits for pauses. And I probably never will be. The patients I've treated for a long time often will ask me, when I'm really anxious, I interrupt. I hope my patients still find that I can be helpful to them. I hope that's true. So the question was from a beloved administrator at one of the high schools I worked at with for 5 years, when did I choose to become a psychiatrist, and do I think that this might have, propelled me to become a psychiatrist? I actually thought I was going to be a pediatrician, and that I was going to work in Harlem at a school that I had worked at as a elementary school teacher, preschool through 3rd grade. I'd been a teacher for a year in between college and medical school. So I thought that's what I was going to do. And then when I was in my third year of medical school, I realized, I was not so interested in looking at ear infections, and I was just dying to talk to the patients. So I migrated to child psychiatry. I always knew from when I was very young that I wanted to be a doctor. And the reasons were fairly prosaic. It was that the doctor toy kit had more candy than the nurse's kit. I would say there's certainly an element that I wanted to save myself and figure out, how I could care for patients in a way that I wished to be cared for myself. And that has been a big joy of me, is to take care of patients. And, one thing I think is important is I want my patients to know that too. I am not taking care of them because I couldn't save my mother. I am taking care of them because I want them to be alive. And when I work with families, I don't want a family to lose someone they love. So the work I do is immense, and it's very gratifying. This is someone from my Harvard Freshman Seminar course where I really have fun, because I would read sometimes chapters from this with the memoir course. And I was agonizing in November about the title, and we went through 700 titles, and we finally got to In Her Wake, which I actually have come to really like. And the way we got it, it was my editor and me that worked on it, was, first of all, I learned something about titles, Darcy, that I didn't know, which is that they have to be short. And the other, jokes aside, was it had multiple meanings, which I also think is true when you're trying to interpret a suicide, is that at different points in my life, going from being a teenager to being a mother to being 30, 40, 50, it's changed. So there are multiple meanings, and it's been redefined. So In Her Wake has a quality of following in the ocean when I can't explain it, but my daughter Lila does cruise, so she could explain it. Something about you go in the wake, you follow something. And then the idea of being in a wake and the death aspect of it. So I've the big question, actually, if you want to know, was the first subtitle was In Her Wake, a child psychiatrist explores the mystery of her mother's death. And they did some, marketing focus group with bookstores. Jeff could probably tell us about that. And people came back and said, that's very confusing, because people don't know, was the death a murder? Was the death a poison? It's too ambiguous. So Basics, which has been an amazing publishing company for me. If any of you all are thinking about publishing books, Basics by far is top down, unbelievably supportive. And I don't know what you call him, the president, the CEO, came to me and sort of said, well, is it okay if we change it from death to suicide? And I'm like, yeah. But, still, I always trip a little bit when I often mumble when I say my mother killed herself when I was 4 years old. People will sometimes ask me a second time because I can't quite get it out. And now, I have to say this title like 1,700 times, and so I'm saying it over and over again. And that, maybe I should have said something different on that subtitle, but I'm stuck with it now. So the question, just so for people who can't hear it, is, she was someone who was ahead of her times. Was this a decision, which is always a question, whether suicide is a decision, that was biological, or was it something that was a statement that she wanted to make? And I think, it goes back to what I started to say, which is the answer dies with her. So I can speculate with you what my best guess is, and that oftentimes when a suicide happens, there are multiple things that happen. And that's why it's so hard for people who are left after a suicide, because they can attach to one thing that happened. I've done some speaking at a patient group, and someone can describe being in a situation where they're blamed for a death of a parent when clearly it couldn't have been because there was a fight at the dinner table. I mean, we have fights all the time at the dinner table, and we don't, so I guess I can't answer that simply. I can say that yes, I think she probably had a mood disorder, although I never interviewed her, and I don't feel comfortable saying that. If I say at one point in the book that probably if I could have given her lithium, I would have, because if you are bipolar, you're 8 times less likely to kill yourself if you're on lithium. But was it a statement? If it was a statement, I wish she'd rewritten the statement. You know, I don't, and actually in the book I say a lot, committed suicide. The wording now that I've found from being involved with different organizations like the American Foundation of Suicide Prevention or Samaritans, which are both terrific organizations, is that you say died by suicide, because committed suicide has a voluntary aspect to it, and we all know that it's probably a very tortured decision, and that the language doesn't capture the complexity of it. What happened was she had won it in the probate court, and then after a 2-year battle, she lost it after her first suicide attempt. She had signed over, and all those details are in the book, but so it gets a little confusing, and don't worry about it because it's slower in the book than the way that I'm talking. She had had a 2-year custody battle. She had won the kids back in July. Then it was bumped up by my father to the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court, and so September 10th, she was supposed to be getting the kids back. She goes into court and it gets stayed. So the decision was for the kids to stay the way they were, which was to remain with my father. So that was when she thought, which is also, though, what I would say is divorces are brutal, you know, and people's best selves don't always come out during that time. And when you put in that with depression, what happens is you think something's permanent and it's never going to change. And part of the work you do in cognitive behavioral therapy is to help people recognize that it may be temporary, and that what seems permanent, there's a little bit of hope that it can be different. So so I would work really hard, and some people at the school-based health centers will testify this, or Ed, you could tell, a former principal, that I work like a maniac from September to June. But in the summer, I have more time to be reflective and to kind of go deep. So that was actually really good. I don't envy anybody who's a full-time writer, at least in this kind of journey. It was really nice to go deep and then put it away. I think repression is a really good thing sometimes. So happy to come and, teach Harvard freshmen and take care of patients and grow a family and write chapters on violence and aggression in children and the meaning of medication and anything else but the book. And so I didn't plan on it taking 18 years. There were twists and turns. But I'm in some ways, now that it's out, I'm glad. I'm really proud of my book. I feel like it's a very carefully titrated book with a lot of thought and objectivity. I don't know if I could have gotten that if I had just been able to write it in 3 months. So I didn't have much choice about it. It took its own life and dominated me. So, oh, that's very sweet. She was asking if watching her grandmother die, because I was with her grandmother right as my book was coming out, whether that made me think of my mother. First of all, it was an amazing privilege to be with your grandmother when she was dying. And, your grandmother was very supportive of me writing this story and very present during this time. So, to get, to have your family ask me to be there during her time of passing from this world to another, and her being 82 years old, was an honor, and was a different kind of death than my mother's death, but definitely Kay was another mother to me. So I hope I die the kind of death and live the kind of life that your grandmother did, because she knew how to be present in people's lives and to be loving. And I watched her as a grandmother, because I have some stepmoms that have been grandparents to my kids, but I haven't had, my mother be that way. So I've learned from her, and so I carry her with me too. And so I think of her differently, but thank you for asking. Lila, when Lila was born, I held this beautiful baby in my arms, and actually when I went, and I thought, you know what, I just knew my mother loved me. I knew it on this visceral level, and I suddenly shifted from being a daughter to being a mother. So that made me try to understand, if my mother loved me, then where is she right now? And so the intensity of wanting to know that, and you'll see when you're a parent, if you end up being a parent, that you end up being reflective about who your parents are at that juncture of becoming a parent. And, we read that article in our class about ghosts in the nursery. So the shadows of your parents comes into play, and you want to figure that out, because you don't want the shadow of a longing or a sense of abandonment or rage to get played out on your kids. So there was at the beginning, there was a certain missionary quality and maybe a bit of being an overachiever. I mean, I don't think I needed to be a child psychiatrist and write a book for 18 years to be a good mom. And then I spend the last 2 chapters really looking at what are the causes of suicide. What do I think about it as a clinician and as a mom and as a daughter? But it's done in a way that, I'm doing a carefully titrated journey, because I don't want to turn my mother into a case study. That would be violating her memory. And yet I am a child psychiatrist, and I'm trying to have the book also be a teaching tool and to have it also be digestible. So there's a quality where I want it to be a psychological thriller, and I also want it to be more than a book about suicide. I think when we tell a story, that we often want it to have universal themes. So in my greatest hope, what I would want is for this to be a story about, we all have things that have happened in our family. It doesn't have to be a suicide. It could be that we were adopted. It could be that we had an alcoholic grandfather, or any kind of multiple things that happen in the life of living. And how do you ask people that you care deeply about uncomfortable questions? And how do you trust yourself that you can find out the answers, even if you're frightened? Which sometimes I have to confess, there were times when I thought, these are questions I don't want to know the answer to. So, do you think that by your mother dying that she became larger than my father? Well, it's a beautiful question, because I can tell you definitively, my father, I have huge loyalty to him. This is not a story meant to polarize our family or to suggest that my father is somehow to blame for this. It's really a story about the damage that happens when there are very, very strong feelings, and sometimes where situations unfold in a excruciating, painful way. And, my father has been there for me. And I'm 50 now, and I got a wonderful birthday card from him that said I was naughty but irresistible. I have tremendous respect for him. If you read the book, the last chapter is about conversation that we had at lunch, and he taught a very important lesson that I use as a child psychiatrist. And what he said was, never allow the child to define the relationship. And I think that's an extremely wise comment that he made. So he's alive and well, and someone that I have, that I love deeply, and my mother has not dwarfed him. So.